For my comparative vertebrate anatomy students, after going through the spinal cord, the brainstem, the cerebellum, the diencephalon, the cerebrum, there's just a couple of topics about how the nervous system works that they should have been exposed to. So this is very short, but just kind of those parts that you should know about the nervous system, which didn't quite fit into the other lectures as easily. The first is that the nervous system is surrounded by fluid, and fluid travels within it. There are specialized capillaries called choroid plexus, which exist in a number of regions of the brain. And here blood is filtered so that then the fluid, which originated from the blood, then becomes cerebrospinal fluid. This cerebrospinal fluid will actually have a current because there is a type of glial cell. Glial cells are the cells of the nervous system which are not neurons. There's a type of glial cell which has cilia, and these cilia then can beat and create a current so that not only is there fluid in and around the nervous system, but that it flows. This fluid helps to support weight, because if you think about the hypothalamus, this important part of the brain is at the bottom. It would be crushed by the weight of this if there wasn't a fluid making everything buoyant. And then this fluid helps then to nourish the cerebrum in that it controls its environment as well. There can even be some signaling. So oxytocin, for example, can be released by one part of the brain and put in the cerebrospinal fluid where it travels and reaches another part of the brain. So if you look at an embryo, you can see that we chordates, we develop a nervous system which is hollow in the middle. So here you see the neural tube. Once again, it is hollow. So that means the brain develops with a space in the middle. Here's a pig spinal cord as an embryo, develops with a space in the middle. And then as adults, we still have these spaces. They've always been there. The nervous system developed as a hollow tube, which we call ventricles. And so the choroid plexus makes this cerebrospinal fluid, which then travels through these lateral ventricles. So here you can see an embryo where you can see these lateral ventricles, and then here in a sheep, the adult. They're called lateral ventricles because if this the midline, obviously they're lateral to this. The corpus callosum goes over them, and then the thalamus is here underneath them. The caudate nucleus is there, and so we have these lateral ventricles. And instead of labeling them 1 and 2, because then you'd have to remember which is 1 on the left or 2 on the right, we just call them the lateral ventricles, and the next one's called the third because these two are here's a developing pig's brain, it's hollow, and then so in the human brain there's the lateral ventricle here. So in this model of the ventricles, these would be the two things on the lateral side. The lateral ventricles then flow into the third ventricle through the interventricular foramen, or the foramen of Monroe. This flow is rather important. So here you see the lateral ventricles here. And if I were to say hit my head and part of my brain could swell, if I blocked this flow, then fluid could start to build up and result in hydrocephaly, result in pressure building up, which would damage nerve cells. So that would be bad. Cerebrospinal fluid flows from the lateral ventricles into the third ventricle, which you can see around the lobes of the thalamus. All right, so there's an interthalamic mass in most people here, but then there's this space around it. So cerebrospinal fluid flows there. And from there, the third ventricle, it flows into the cerebral aqueduct as it passes through the midbrain. So you can see the third ventricle here. Notice the interthalamic mass is a little less. Here in a frontal section, there's the third ventricle. So lateral ventricle to the third ventricle. Third ventricle would be here in red. And then from the third ventricle through this cerebral aqueduct, which is easy to see in the midbrain because the tectum of the midbrain, the superior and inferior colliculi, are above that. So there's the cerebral aqueduct there. And then from there, the CSF flows into the fourth ventricle, which is at the base of the cerebellum. So here you can see the cerebellum, and here you can see the fourth ventricle at its base. From there, the cerebrospinal fluid can either continue through the spinal cord, because if you remember, the spinal cord has an opening in the middle of this central canal where CSF can pass, or it can pass through what's known as the subarachnoid space. So around the nervous system, there are meninges, and the meninges then have three layers: the dura mater, the arachnoid, and the pia mater is a very thin film on the surface of the brain and spinal cord. And between the arachnoid and the pia, there is a subarachnoid space. In the subarachnoid space are these finger-like projections called arachnoid villi, which can reabsorb the CSF. So every day we're making this fluid at the choroid plexus, it's being reabsorbed at the arachnoid villi, and it flows throughout the ventricles and channels of the central nervous system. All right, so that was one topic. A second of the three topics I'd like to mention are the cranial nerves. Now, cranial nerves are so important, and you certainly get that impression, because very often if you look at the chapter of a textbook, it'll often say the brain and the cranial nerves. We used to show our classes a video that was the brain and the cranial nerves, and you think, why is the brain, having to share its spotlight with the cranial nerves? Isn't it important enough? Well, two things. One, I always argued that, since the old instructors, when they were young, had to memorize these cranial nerves in the order that when they become teachers, they make their students do that. So there's that. But then obviously, people fall down and they hit their heads. Kids get hit in the head when they try to catch a baseball. I certainly did. Kids hit, windshields if the car, stops too quickly. And here's the question, did you do damage? All right, because you don't have enough money to give everyone who falls and hits their head an MRI. But if you can localize damage and correct it, this then prevents permanent brain damage, because brain cells, they when they die, they don't regenerate. And so you have to be able to distinguish between a serious injury and a not serious injury. And if someone has just fallen, you say, here, follow my finger with your eyes. If you do, you've just checked three different parts of the brainstem coming through three different cranial nerves. And so as far as diagnosing the severity of injury, these cranial nerves are certainly very important. So we number the nerves coming out of the brain. Out of the cerebrum, the first cranial nerve is the olfactory nerve. The olfactory bulbs are where we perceive smell. There are neurons there, which then go through the ethmoid bone, through those holes in the cribriform plate, those olfactory foramina. And then we have that small olfactory bulb here. So these nerves are cranial nerve 1. So there's lots of little ones. So cranial nerve 1, cranial nerve 1. Cranial nerve 1 are all of these little olfactory nerves which travel from the olfactory epithelium. It's a sensory nerve, all right? There are three cranial nerves which are sensory. The second one is cranial nerve 2, the optic nerve. So coming from the retina, there are optic nerves, which then crisscross at an X known as the optic chiasma, so that most of the information from the right eye goes to the left half of the cerebrum with this optic chiasm. Now, technically, if we wanted to split hairs, we would say this isn't technically a nerve because the retina is technically a part of the brain, which then as we develop as embryos just gets moved forward. So it's really not connecting the body to the brain. The retina is actually part of the brain, but optic nerve is its most common name. And then after they crisscross, a lot of people will call this the optic tract. So the olfactory nerve, number 1, that does smell, the optic nerve number 2 that does vision. The way I like to present it is then there are 3. So let's jump to cranial nerve 8. Cranial nerve 8, this processes the senses from the ear. It was once called the auditory nerve. And that's how I learned it. But then the ear does more than just hear. All right, so not only is the cochlea the place of the ear where we hear, but it also has the vestibule. So it's measuring balance and acceleration. So now cranial nerve 8 is called the vestibulocochlear nerve, cranial nerve 8. And so just as you learn the functions, I think the fact that there are 3 which are sensory makes that rather easy. There are 3 which move the eye. All right, and so once again, this is just really quick for students trying to master some degree of the cranial nerves. And so 3 cranial nerves, their primary jolt is just to move the eye. So when you ask someone to follow a movement with your eye, you're checking the ocular motor nerve, which is cranial nerve 3, the trochlear nerve, which comes out from the dorsal part of the brainstem, that's cranial nerve 4, and the abducens nerve, cranial nerve 6. And so they all move the eye. I'm going through this very quickly somewhere. So if you had trouble moving, your eye, you could then look at each of these 3 as like, oh, this is typical of damage to the nucleus, which controls the ocular motor nerve, depending on which of the muscles they innervate, etc. Once again, just if you were to try to master these, I like to teach my students that the trigeminal nerve and the facial nerve are kind of like evil twins of each other, in that the trigeminal nerve helps us to feel the face, so we can feel our face. And so the trigeminal nerve does that, but it controls chewing muscles. So using the trigeminal, we feel the face and move the mouth. So it's what's called a mixed nerve. All right, so some nerves are primarily sensory, some are primarily motor, but there are mixed nerves which do both. So the trigeminal allows us to feel our face and move our mouth in chewing, while the facial nerve is kind of the opposite of that. It allows us to move our face, say from facial expressions, but we can feel our mouth because much of what we call taste is being transmitted through the facial nerve. So I think they're easy to play against each other. Now, obviously, through education that lots of things are a little more complex than often they are presented. So taste is actually a little more complicated, so that while certainly the front of the tongue, where we're sensing like sweet, salty, sour, is traveling through the facial nerve, bitter tastes are coming from the glossopharyngeal nerve on the back of the tongue, where bitter tastes are perceived. But then even the vagus nerve, cranial nerve 10, is helping out with taste, especially from the esophagus. I'm sorry, especially from the pharynx and the roof of the mouth. Little children have more taste buds, especially in those areas, than we do as adults. The last cranial nerve that I really emphasize with my students is the vagus nerve. The vagus nerve is really important in the final topic, the parasympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system. Through the vagus nerve, we're getting about 80% of parasympathetic output. So, we feel our guts and then we send commands to our guts, like our heart rate, our breathing, our digestive system, etc. So it is the vagus nerve, cranial nerve 10, which is most important there. So I skipped a couple of the glossopharyngeal nerve. I'm going to the throat, having roles in swallowing. The accessory nerves, they, among other things, can help send commands to the neck to move that. The hypoglossal, whenever you see the word glossus, that's referring to tongue. And so the hypoglossal nerve helps us move our tongue. And so just for anatomy students, very often one of the things they are asked to do is to label the cranial nerves in order, so that you just know, oh, cranial nerve 8, that's the vestibulocochlear nerve, cranial nerve 3, that's the ocular motor nerve, etc. And very often the way that students do this is they come up with an acronym. And so I go through the most common acronym here in this video, which you're welcome to go. It's a bit it, has sexual references. But once again, that's almost the point, because once again, the parts of the brain which are involved in memory, things like the amygdala, the hippocampus, they're also part of the limbic system. So if you're memorizing, if you have a choice of two acronyms, one of which does not get an emotional rise out of you and the other one does, pick the one that does. All right, because the part of your brain that governs emotions is also the parts of the brain which are encoding memories. You're far more likely to remember the things that generate emotions than you are the things that aren't. Okay, finally then, the autonomic nervous system is, whoops. So the autonomic nervous system is the part of the body that governs either between the fight or flight response or the rest and repose response. And just in general, your body's big, all right? And so if you're going to coordinate the body, it's important that like everyone's on the same page. Like if it's an emergency and you should be running for your life, you can't have your heart know this, but the lungs not. Right, so your heart can beat faster, but the purpose is that you're getting more oxygen to your muscles. So if the lungs aren't dilating their respiratory passageways, then you're not getting in more oxygen in the blood. So you're sending, it helps if whatever messages are going out, the heart gets it and the lungs get it. And if now you have oxygen in your blood, but instead of sending it to your muscles you're using for running, you're sending it to your spleen, well, that's not going to help you, as you run for your life. And so everyone kind of has to be on the same page. And that's the purpose here. There's this autonomic nervous system, which runs the guts and then has a sympathetic division, which governs the fight or flight response. So when we exercise, when there's an emergency, we use that. There's a parasympathetic division, which then governs the rest and repose response. Now, the autonomic nervous system is a little bit different, because what's called the somatic nervous system, that is how we send commands to muscle, skeletal muscle. But your brain commands more than just skeletal muscle. So while the somatic nervous system sends commands to skeletal muscle, the autonomic nervous system sends commands to everything else. Your cardiac muscle, your smooth muscle, your exocrine glands, your endocrine glands, your adipose even, your immune cells. And so we have a lot of commands. Once again, the SNS is sending commands to skeletal muscle. Your ANS is sending commands to everything else. There are more differences, but this is meant to be just really quick, thorough. So in the autonomic nervous system, there is always a synapse. So unlike the somatic nervous system, where the neuron which leaves the brain or spinal cord actually then goes and touches the skeletal muscle, in the autonomic nervous system, we always talk about two neurons. The first one that comes before the ganglion, that's called the preganglionic neuron, and the other one that leaves the ganglion and goes to the effector organ, the postganglionic neuron. Obviously, we'd have to talk about the neurotransmitters release. So some of these autonomic neurons are releasing epinephrine and norepinephrine, what's often called adrenaline. Those are adrenergic, while other ones are releasing acetylcholine. Those are cholinergic fibers. One of the fascinating things for me is that some of these neurons, they don't have like this fixed synapse the way you would expect at a neuromuscular junction, where this neuron then is touching this part of the nerve cell at a specific spot. Say, aha, there's a synapse. What we see in the autonomic nervous system is that the axons, they'll end with these moving parts, these moving bulbs. So when they release neurotransmitters, they're not specifically releasing it like one place specifically, but there are cells in this area which can respond, like lots of immune cells. Your nervous system is actually talking to your immune system and vice versa. Your immune system makes signals that your nerve cells can respond to. So even though this isn't like a traditional synapse, the way we often understand it, nevertheless, your brain is sending signals to the to the immune system and receiving responses. So the sympathetic division, which is going to govern the fight or flight response, it leaves the spinal cord from the middle. So it's sometimes called the thoracolumbar division, while the parasympathetic division sends its commands through the brainstem and the sacral division. It's often called the craniosacral divisions, and the vagus nerve carries most of the parasympathetic fibers. The sympathetic division is rather complex. So obviously I have a playlist where I'm going through this in greater detail, where you can, trace the different, axons which leave. One very important anatomical difference is in the sympathetic division, there are neurons which go to the middle of the adrenal gland. This is known as the adrenal medulla. And they release epinephrine, but instead of releasing it as a neurotransmitter at a synapse, so a neurotransmitter is something that you release at a synapse, instead they put their epinephrine into the blood. Now, if you're then releasing it into a blood, like epinephrine, now it can affect the heart, even if the cells don't touch the heart. So the sympathetic division actually does. It sends cardiac acceleratory nerves to touch the heart to say, hey, speed up. But it then will also put epinephrine into the blood, where it acts as a hormone saying, heart, speed up. So the sympathetic division then also can send commands all throughout the body, even to cells that even the cells of the body that nerve cells do not touch. So non-innervated cells, because it puts epinephrine into the blood at the adrenal medulla. So thus epinephrine acts as a hormone in this sense. So just to wrap up then, the two divisions, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic division, in general, the sympathetic division is doing what we need to have done during an emergency. During an emergency, you might have to run very fast. You might have to fight for your life. We would also use this during exercise. And so in this scenario, you need your body's resources to go to muscles. So your heart, beats faster, send blood to muscles. Your blood pressure, your heart rate go up, and then also. You need more oxygen in this blood so muscle cells can break down glucose for energy. So your respiratory passageways dilate. So now we have more oxygen in the blood. Your liver, your fat cells, they're releasing energy-rich molecules so that then you will have, energy molecules to break down in the muscle. And then you shunt blood towards the muscles. So you don't send blood everywhere all the time. You make decisions. Oh, now I'll go send blood here. Now I'll send blood there. So if during an emergency, if you were to see this lion, right, you want to run. And so your heart beats faster, your respiratory system dilates, your liver, et cetera, put energy molecules into the blood, and you send them to your muscles. So now you can run faster, et cetera. You would change your blood, so it would clot faster. And then you send less blood to other places. If there's an emergency, you don't need to be digesting your last meal right now. You don't need to be fighting off the flu. You don't need to be making urine. You don't need to be thinking about your partner. And so you direct blood away from the digestive, urinary, reproductive, and immune systems. However, when we're at rest, then the parasympathetic division takes over. And now it's time to have your heart rate go down. Your respiratory passageways constrict. You don't send blood to your muscles. You don't put clotting factors in your blood to the same degree. You decrease the tension in your muscles. And now you are sending blood to your digestive system. So you digest your last meal. Your urinary system, you filter your blood to get urea out. Your immune system, so you're going to monitor for disease and for cancer. Your reproductive system. So then there are things that we do, best when we are at rest with the parasympathetic division, and things that we do best during sympathetic stimulation. Now, in the modern world, a problem is that stresses last a while. For our ancestors, stress was you run away from that big animal, and one way or the other, it's over in 10 minutes. But modern stresses are like a difficult month at work, or relationship, issues, or a finals week, or an accelerated course, in college, or whatever. And so many of our stressful scenarios are chronic stress. And that's a problem because while the sympathetic division is a great um, a system to respond to ancient stresses where we run fast for a short period of time and then we're done. It's a lousy system if you're going to be using it constantly, because as you direct blood away from your digestive system, you're not digesting very well. If you're directing blood and resources away from the immune system, you're more likely to get sick and cancer. If you're directing blood away from your reproductive system, you're less interested in your partner. You're less, capable of, being with your partner. And because you've increased like heart rate, the energy molecules in your blood, your clotting factors, you're now increasing your blood pressure. You're increasing your risk of diabetes and heart disease. You're increasing the risk of having a clot form that would cause a heart attack or stroke. And so actually a lot of the problems that people suffer in the modern world is because they are using this sympathetic division, which was meant to deal with short-term stresses, in the long-term for chronic stresses, and that's a problem. So once again, I have playlists that go through these more thoroughly, but I just wanted to add a couple of important concepts to the end of the treatment of the nervous system. But obviously students who need more of a description can find it in those playlists.